What were some of the challenges of writing in so many voices, tones, registers? How do you manage to get into all of that so quickly? And what were the challenges you faced in doing it?
Well, they're immense. Even as an undergraduate or graduate student, in the United States at least, you are basically told this is not what you're supposed to be doing, right? You pick one voice, right? You pick it, and you also think very carefully about point of view shifts, et cetera, because you want to allow the reader, I think, a particular kind of way into
Sure.
the character. And I think, I'm mindful of that. At the same time, I've also been very, very interested as a reader in texts that sort of play with the rules or challenge the rules, right?
Hey, I'm Jon.
I'm Cory,
And this is The Passage,
the podcast where authors break down their favorite pieces of writing
taking you behind the scenes from the first spark of inspiration
to the final edits and everything in between. Jon, our guest today, is also named Jon Keene, and we will be talking about his book Counternarratives, an inventive and experimental collection of stories and novellas that spans 5 centuries of history across the Americas. Jon is an award-winning author, poet, and translator. He is a 2018 MacArthur Fellow and winner of the National Book Award for his 2022 poetry collection, Punks. Counternarratives was originally published in 2015, and it was just reissued in a new paperback edition this year by Fitzcarraldo, a UK publisher that you might recognize by their distinctively uniform blue anti-covers. So, what is Counternarratives exactly? I would describe most of its stories as exploring figures from the margins of history, people who were overlooked or sidelined from what you might call the traditional records. One story, the one that we're going to hear about today, actually begins with an excerpt from an obscure late 1800s history of Roman Catholics in early America. Jon puts an asterisk next to a passing reference to a 19th century Kentucky convent, and then he expands it into an 80-page footnote that is kind of a gothic novella about a Haitian enslaved woman. Another story from the collection is all about what happens when Jim, Huckleberry Finn, and Tom Sawyer run into each other years after Twain's stories end. And another one that really stuck with me is a fascinating and really kind of heartbreaking account of the last days of the early 1900s composer and performer Bob Cole. I'll be honest, this is not the easiest read, stylistically or thematically, but it is a gorgeously written book, and it's one that rewards patience and maybe, quite frankly, some homework. Jon, I will say up front that to be honest, I'm a little bit intimidated just about having to come up with this intro. Part of me feels like I've only scratched the surface of your book, and I, frankly, am not very well qualified to say anything particularly smart about it. So here's what I will say. Some of these stories I've now read multiple times, and each go-round there's something new that I've discovered. I've been going down these internet rabbit holes where I read a little bit more about the history that you used as inspiration, and then I immediately want to go back and reread them again and sort of see something new. Counternarratives is exactly the type of book that makes me wonder, how the heck did this get made? So in that sense, it's a perfect fit for this show. Jon Keene, welcome to The Passage.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful introduction, and please don't feel intimidated. I mean, I wanted to write a book that rewards rereading. So it gives you certain pleasures the first go round, but if you have the time and the interest, if you reread, I hope that more and more layers reveal themselves.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So, Jon, you're going to read something from one of the novellas in this book. Is there anything that we need to know about what the novella is, or before you start reading, anything to sort of give our listeners some context?
What I'm going to read, as you mentioned the story called Gloss. That's how I usually refer to it, but it's got a long title. It does start out as if it is a section from a history of, as you said, Roman Catholics in the early American Republic, right? But then the story breaks off. There's a footnote, and then the footnote essentially takes over. So the gloss takes over. So basically, we get the kind of counter history that otherwise would not be told. I'll read this little section first, and so you can just kind of hear the story, and then we'll talk more about the process.
Excellent. Perfect.
Gloss on a history of Roman Catholics in the early American Republic, 1790 to 1825, or The Strange History of Our Lady of the Sorrows. That's the title. A History of Roman Catholics in the Early American Republic, 1790 to 1825, Joseph N.O. de la Carr Francis and Ambrose Carroll Meyer, Boston, Flaherty and Smith, 1895. The status of the ancient faith differed on the eastern shores of the Mississippi and its southerly tributaries. A convent and a school established at the turn of the 19th century are referred to indirectly in the records of His Holiness Bishop John Carroll of the Diocese of Baltimore, whose curacy extended at that time to the far western frontiers of the Virgin Republic's lands. A specific reference may be found, however, in the personal papers of Father Auguste Marie Maliveau, a native of Saint-Domingue, whose evangelistic labors encompassed the Spanish and later French territories from Louisiana as far north as the Great Lakes. Maliveau offers brief notations on the convent and school, which he asserts were the first in this region. Flemish nuns of the Order of the Most Precious Charity of Our Lady of the Sorrows, established both near the village of New Hurtstown in this frontier west region of western Kentucky in 1800. Because the convent and school suddenly vanished without a trace, and within several years the order itself disappeared as well, and as the nearby non-Catholic settlement suffered through a series of calamities before dwindling to near extinction until its reestablishment in 1812, no other definitive records of this foundation remain. It was not until the Reverend Charles Narrant, the native of Hereford. Carmel was the lone child among the handful of bondspeople remaining at Valderay, the coffee plantation to which Olivier de la Carr returned in late July 1803. The estate, over which his elder brother Nicolas had presided for more than 2 decades, clung like a forget-me-not to the cliffs high above the coastal city of Jérémie, west of the Rivière Grandance and the southern district of the colony of Saint-Domingue. Nearly all of Valderay's able-bodied bondswomen, and men, who at the height of the estate's prosperity numbered more than 125 souls, had fled or been slain during the successive waves of liberation, revolt, and retribution that had convulsed the colony since the first flash of rebellion in France. By edict of the Revolution, they had already been freed first across the sea and on these shores again by Sonthonax's pen against Nicolas de la Carr and the other plantation owners' wishes. Then, under the threat of Napoleon's guns, they had been captured or forced to return to Valderay, and just as soon, many had swiftly escaped, parents, children, all, into the surrounding green maze of forests, hills, and mountains, eventually joining or merging into the various rebel fronts, including those led by the leaders Plymouth and Micaiah, that coursed throughout the long dagger of peninsula upwards into the Ardibonite Valley. Others, nevertheless, had pledged their futures and future freedom to the Tricolor's military and its repeated campaigns to reclaim what had for years been France's Caribbean mint. And I'll stop there. So I feel like almost like that is written really as much for the eye as for the ear. But the first little passage, of course, is supposed to be a snippet from that history. And then, of course, you get the asterisk at no other definitive records of this foundation remain. And then that's where the counter history takes over.
The starting passage that comes from the history is cut off mid-word, at least in the version that I looked at it. That's how it's printed in the book as well?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
That's how it should be, yes.
Yeah. I came to this knowing sort of very little about these stories, and I kind of had to do a double take a little bit and make sure that I had printed it out correctly. Which I then liked a lot. As soon as I sort of understood that that's what was happening, I thought, oh, that's really a fascinating way to get into this counter narrative. It works really well. Cory and I know have a bunch of questions about this, but I'll start with a really easy one. Where did you write this passage?
The first 2 stories I wrote, one was an outtake from the ideological origins of the American Revolution. And I was a graduate student at New York University, and I was in a workshop with E.L. Doctorow. It was an amazing teacher. And he was very encouraging. He said, there's a very interesting combo here. He said, because usually writers who are interested in the experimental are not so much interested in history. So anyway, that story became the start for a series of stories. Then I wrote Persons and Places because I was reading the actual eponymous memoir by George Santayana called Persons and Places. So that story was the second story, and that's a 2-column story. It's almost like a prose poem, right? And then I reached a kind of impasse, And I said, how do I move forward? And so then the third story, I was invited by the little journal, which no longer exists, but they were an incredible little journal, Encyclopedia, to submit a story. And so Encyclopedia had this really interesting prompt in which they would give you two words. And I think they picked them at random. So my two words were Brazil and denouement. Half reading the instructions, I thought, oh, I got these two words. And that, of course, was teaching creative writing at the time, as I still do. And I thought, well, one of the more challenging things to convey to students is the idea of, or the kind of the concept of denouement. So I actually wrote a story in which I play with the idea of denouement, and it's set in Brazil. Okay, so once I wrote that story, I had a breakthrough because I realized, okay, you actually can pair these two deep interests, right? On the one hand, kind of an interest in history and exploring the hemisphere. And on the other hand, what one might call analytic fiction, a kind of fiction with a critical function. So anyway, so that story allowed me to work through a lot of these things. And I realized, it was extremely compressed. And so I then decided there were a bunch of other stories I wanted to write. And this was one of them. And so at the time I was teaching in Northwestern, and I would go to Northwestern's library and, did a lot of research there about Haiti, the Haitian Revolution. I mean, I knew some of this stuff, but did more. Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution, right? To sort of get those, the revolutionary years, right? So I was doing all this reading, and I had I think about four stories, and then my computer crashed,
Hmm.
and I had not printed them out, and so I had notes, but it was devastating. And of course, so I, immediately, tried to get the, computer repaired. They were able to save, of course, all my teaching files. I still have them.
Everything but what you actually wanted. Yeah.
Right, exactly. All my syllabi. I mean, which
Wow.
is great. It's like, okay, all my syllabi. And so much of that creative work, if I had not printed it out or sent to myself an email, particularly those stories, right? Because I had, I think, prior backups. Anyway, so those were gone and they were long. So I was devastated. So I went through a kind of period of mourning. And then probably around I want to say 2012, 2013, I said, okay, I'm going to go back to Counternarratives and I'm going to finish this collection. And so with this story, I completely reconstructed it and wrote it from fresh. Well, not from scratch, because it was in my head, right? These things, as you guys are creative people, these things live in your consciousness. But I realized, in a sense, the story that I actually wrote was much more interesting than that earlier version, because I don't think in that earlier version, for example, I had this journey of the character from basically muteness, wordlessness, no speech, to becoming the narrator, totally claiming
Yeah.
her voice, her own
Mm.
voice, right? And becoming she's the protagonist, but I think it's interesting because when I think about it now too, also, I mean, of course, I was reading people like Fred Moten, Saidiya Hartman, Robert F. Reed Farr, et cetera. But, if you had said to me when I was writing this story, if you had asked me about something like Afro-pessimism, I would have said, what are you talking about? Why are you talking? But now, of course, I mean, this is a theory that has great currency. But I realize, of course, in a sense, that, I mean, the story is working through a lot of the ideas that were out there that I didn't have a name for. A kind of character who exists in a state of social death, right? She has no protection. She has no power. Well, at least she seemingly has no power. She has no protection, no power. She's an orphan in a sense. Both of her parents are killed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mother actually is an active rebel. Her father, as we see, is really an artist, right? And she gains the sort of skills of both parents, right? But doesn't know how to wield them because he has no education. And so she has to, in a sense, utilize the tools of a colonial education, right, which are counter to her existence,
Mm-hmm.
to realize her own powers, right? And this is the kind of story of Black people and other colonized people, Black people in the Americas, but in the United States and in the Americas, but also colonized people all over the globe, right? So I mean, so the story became more and more complex, and I think I realized that it was becoming a much more interesting story than that earlier version when I got to that section where almost kind of up out of me somewhere that pigeon
Hmm.
journal that she
Yep.
keeps, the pigeon diary
Yep.
that she keeps, just started to, appear in my consciousness. And I was like, I've got to write this down. I'm going to lose it, right? And then I thought, after I finished that section, and of course I went through and revised like multiple times. But I thought maybe I should take this out because it's just going to be too difficult for readers, et cetera. But then I thought, no, 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 because what I want to show the reader is that we don't always have full access to characters, right? I mean, even I as a writer don't have full access, right? But I still have the charge
Hmm.
to depict, to create this character, and to give as much of a glimpse of who she is as possible, to make her as full and rich around, while also maintaining that opacity that Edouard Glissant talks about, right? So I think that was a very interesting process, like, writing this story. When I taught at Northwestern, and I mentioned I taught undergraduate creative writing and graduate creative writing, for the fiction writers, they would write, I think, the 3 or 4 short stories, each based on various models, right? And then in the second half of this course, they would write a novella.
Hmm.
And so the first few times I taught this, I realized, okay, first of all, I read many novellas, but I've never written a novella, right? And so I'm teaching students how to write a novella, and I haven't written one myself. So the other component to this process was saying to myself, you have been telling students what a novella is. You've been reading novellas your entire life, right? And you've been teaching them what novellas are, right? Write a novella yourself.
Jon, we started off by asking you where you wrote this story, and we have gone into so many splintered directions that touch on a bunch of questions that I was already going to ask you. Why don't we take it back? When we first started this call, I was actually fairly confident that the history book that forms the sort of opening of this story is a real history book, but now I'm actually not so sure. Is there an actual late 1800s book, A History of Roman Catholics in the Early American Republic?
Well, there may be, but this is completely made up.
Completely
Right?
made up.
Yes.
Well, then, first of all, I've read this story twice and it fooled me both times. But that actually brings up a really interesting, because you sort of talked about the stylistic changes. I would love, actually, because I'm going to assume that most of the people who are listening to this maybe have not read the story yet. Could you explain a little bit just the stylistic changes that happen over the course of this story? Because we start, obviously, with this monograph. And then the footnote itself, which is 99% of the novella, actually goes through a number of evolutions or changes. We start in the third person, we end in the first person. Can you talk a little bit about just what those changes are? At what point did you sort of figure out these are going to be the sections? And thematically, what were you trying to do as you kind of moved from one to the other?
So the main body of the story, which is in that footnote, it follows a trajectory. So it starts with this seemingly neutral, but not really neutral, third person omniscient narration. It's somewhat academic.
Mhm.
It makes all kinds of assumptions about what you would know about European and Caribbean history, particularly the history of France and Haiti and France's colonies, and the relationship between France and the United States, et cetera. So it makes all of these assumptions, right? And it also, in a sense, almost objectifies the protagonist, Carmel, right? The thing I wanted to make very clear is the first word in the long section that begins with the footnote is the name of the protagonist, Carmel. I center her. So even though she is objectified, in a sense, she exists in a state of social death, right? And it's like almost all this clamor around her. He is the guiding star, but we cannot hear her. And what the story suggests early on is we don't know why she doesn't speak, right? I mean, we could say, now we would say that it could be any number of reasons, right? Various traumas, PTSD, congenital muteness. We don't know. We're also told, it was hinted that maybe her mother put a spell on her or cut her tongue out so she wouldn't reveal secrets. But we also get the sense their mother would have done that to her, right? But anyway, so she doesn't speak. She has to figure out a way to communicate. Can this person who is basically, in a sense, barred from language, from speech, from participation, in the society. Can she speak? How can she speak? So the story takes this journey from this third person, and it stays in the third person, but we get closer and closer and closer and closer to Carmel. And then we have this section where we get her diary. So it's a way of seeing her interiority without the usual ways we think of interiority, like the depicting the interiority, right? Because this is her writing her thoughts down. They're in this very compressed form, as I said, as a form of pigeon. She is mixing English, French, Creole, and Latin, because of course they would be instructed in Latin. The counterpoint to this is her mistress, right? Because the family that she belonged to, most of the members of the family have succumbed to the revolution, right? But the young mistress who owns her, is the official enrollee at the school, and run by these nuns from Belgium. And she doesn't want to do any schoolwork. She wants to get the hell out of there. She wants to go back to either Washington, where her family is, or she meets this guy in the town. I'm not going to give too much away, but she meets this guy in the town. They start something up, right? And of course, but then there's a whole other thing because Carmel thinks that she's having this affair with the priest, and it's not that there's the gothic, there's romance, there's just all kinds of things woven in here, and then Carmel basically falls in love with one of the fellow enslaved girls. They become friends, right? And then as she begins to wield her powers, of course, the narration switches. And then you also have these dialogues where Carmel's mother is trying to speak to her, across time and space, right? And, Carmel doesn't know how to communicate with her. She sort of has the tools, but she doesn't have the tools. And the same is true with her. She has this extraordinary predictive power. Her father was a visual artist, and so she draws, but she can't control it. And so when she goes into these kind of spells, right? I love the multiple meanings of spell, right? You cast a spell, but you can suffer a spell, right? She goes into these spells and then she draws what is going to happen, but she doesn't. It's almost like like a seizure of a sort because she can't control it. And the people around her, they're kind of scared, They're like, what's going on? She's using charcoal and stuff on whitewashed walls. There's a thought that it's diabolical, but of course we come to understand that in fact it's not diabolical, but it's predictive, right? But yes, that trajectory is from no speech, no voice, and as a kind of object of the text into subjectivity, radical subjectivity.
What were some of the challenges of writing in so many voices, tones, registers? How do you manage to get into all of that so quickly? And what were the challenges you faced in doing it?
Well, they're immense. Even as an undergraduate or graduate student, in the United States at least, you are basically told this is not what you're supposed to be doing, right? You pick one voice, right? You pick it, and you also think very carefully about point of view shifts, etc., because you want to allow the reader, I think, a particular kind of way into
Sure.
the character. And I think, I'm mindful of that. At the same time, I've also been very, very interested as a reader in texts that sort of play with the rules or challenge the rules, right? And so, I think I've learned, for good or ill, from many people. I think about people like Toni Morrison, Ishmael Reed, of course, mentioned Doctorow, Wilson Harris. I mean, just go down the list of these, writers. And of course, I feel like now it's not even so much issue because you have someone like Laszlo Krasznahorkai winning the Nobel Prize, these long sentences, these point of view shifts, et cetera, right? Or someone who's become very famous like Matthias Enar, right? There are many examples of people playing with all of these rules. I mean, the other thing too, there was a period when I was younger when I was reading a lot of Latin American writers. And again, I think especially those boom writers and the writers who were parallel to the boom writers, people like Reinaldo Arenas, Severo Sarduy, Jose Lozama Lima, who were writing these very, Guillermo Cabrera Infante, who were writing, and what was his name? Eduardo Galeano, who were writing these very, very demanding experimental texts that were dealing with history and society and sexuality and, politics and not in the sort of straightforward way we usually get, right? I mean, and again, there are many examples in American literature too of great experimentalists, right? But I was fascinated by those texts because I felt like they were capturing something essential about the society that these writers were living in, right? I mean, I think of, a book like The Great Gatsby, let's say, or, the work of someone like Ernest Gaines, which is, fairly straightforward, but very sort of pared down and beautiful. But then I think the other approach also is useful as well. So yeah. So I think that was what I grew upon as a writer. I mean, another person who was very important to me was William Faulkner.
Hmm.
And I always remember coming across The Sound and the Fury and thinking, oh, this is an impossible book. But seeing about that text, and then later on, also before, but coming back to a book like Soul Clap Hands and Sing by Paul Marshall, who was another amazing teacher at NYU. These are texts that kind of showed me the way to do the work I was trying to do in counter narratives.
Did you sense that you had hit on something really special when you found Carmel's sort of first person voice? Did that come at the end of writing the story? Because the shift there, it's not the shift, but it's really a kind of payoff. The payoff is kind of extraordinary when you're reading the story and you finally get this like fully formed, kind of spellbinding narrative for a few pages. It really works. It's hard to imagine the story without it. Did you know that when you were writing it, when you found that voice?
I didn't. In fact, I was I was as surprised as you, because I was writing it and I was thinking, well, one question was, how am I going to end this? Like, I had the idea that the townspeople are going to come, they're going to try to burn down the convent, because these bizarre things have been happening, right? You mentioned, like, this, it is very gothic in a way, right? These bizarre things have been happening, like a kind of like a flood, and a dead baby pops up. I mean, so the question is, like, how much are, these people going to take? But I didn't know, like, how to get to the end. And then I thought, and I think as I was writing, I realized Carmel is growing more and more powerful. She's learning not just all of her studies, right?
Yeah.
And she's not just learning, about the world around her, but she's learning who she is. And the more that I realized she was able to harness her power, the more I realized she would be able to harness her voice. And the interesting thing is, well, I'm not going to give it away, but as you see at the end of the story, she talks to the reader, but she talks to everyone else.
Yeah.
But not in the usual way we think,
Yeah.
right?
I'm very curious, Jon, because you had sort of mentioned earlier that a rough draft or maybe some notes for this story existed, was on a computer that crashed and you lost it all. You took a little while off before you returned to it. What do you remember about that draft? It sounds like it was probably less experimental stylistically than what ended up in the finished version.
Yeah, so that version did start off with the asterisk, right? It was supposed to be, kind of a footnote. And the thing was, I was a little skeptical of my approach early on, because I thought, is this like, more postmodern hijinks, because we're past the postmodern era, but I mean, I'm a product of that era, and I thought, okay, people are going to say, oh, this is like, David Foster Wallace on steroids or something.
Too clever.
Too clever by half, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that earlier version, it was not as long. So it resolved with the convent being burned down, and Carmel wielding her power. But I think it was still in the third person. And as I said, it was much shorter. There was no journal in, pigeon journal. The other thing I realized, I was having fun with this story. There's that section where so they're trying to figure out whose baby that is that it's found, right? Like, and they're the townspeople, like, it's got to be the people in the convent. So I had that. I thought, okay, how far can I go here, right? I mean, I think it was a few years ago, there were like all these movies there was that one movie that was called Benedetta, which was just so over the top. And then, of course, there's a famous Ken Russell movie, The Devils, right? So I'm not I wouldn't go in that direction, but I thought, okay, I do want to kind of push this and have a little fun with this, because, like, they have to have an inspection. Like, they have to prove that it was not one of them who had this baby. And so they do the inspection. And I was like, how can I write it so that it would be very true to life, in the sense that they don't really ever say what they're trying to really get at, but go right up to the line, right? Then also, that is one of those moments where we see Carmel wield her powers. Because she essentially, with Eugenie, her mistress, she essentially, I don't know, heals her or transforms her, and it's like, and so I also wanted the reader to say, what on earth is going on? Right. But so that wasn't, that was not in that first version, right? But the thing is that those digressions, I feel, they add depth to the story. They also make one question, like, how do we understand knowledge? Because a lot of these stories really are about questions of knowledge, right? They're about epistemology and repeating epistemology. Like, how do we understand what it is we know or don't know, right? And this, I think, it's become even more pressing in the moment in this era of AI, you know?
Jon, thematically, you sort of talk about a through line is Carmel figuratively, literally finding her voice, becoming more powerful. Was that a part of the initial idea, or does that, from your creative process, do things like that pop up in the middle of drafts and then you realize, oh, this is actually the thematic through line, and subsequent revisions build on that?
So yes, well, so let me say this: in the original version, the trajectory was from Haiti to the U.S. Right? I was really interested in that journey. You know, for example, the current pope, you know, one of his ancestors was Haitian, right? And in I believe in Louisiana, and then you know, in one census they were recorded. He was recorded as black, and then you know, several censuses later, their family, you know, becomes or I think they might have been mixed race, and then they become white, right? So again, I was sort of interested, like I was trying to think about, like, you know, again, not to put that in the foreground, but in the background, like all these things, like what about these journeys that we don't really ever talk about or think about, but that are sort of embedded in the deep fabric, the deep textures of this society. So it wasn't so much her voice that I was thinking about, but it was the actual geographical journey. But in the rewriting, that is when it came to me that it is really about her voice as much as the geography, as much as that journey. It's a physical journey, it's a material journey, but it's also a psychological and emotional trajectory, and one of her capacity to speak, right? What does that speech look like on the page? What does it sound like, right? And I think there's a contrast even to, as you can hear, you know, between that very sort of dense, formal, historical language in the beginning and the richer, fuller human voice, the you know, discourse we get from the, like, at a certain point in the story to the end. So in a sense, right, you know, the ending of the story ironizes the entire story. I mean, the story itself is ironic, but that ending really ironizes the kind of the fundamental conceit of the story
Yeah.
for voicelessness.
And is that normal for your creative process to arrive at what ends up being maybe the sort of primary thread that's holding everything together? Is that usually how it works for you?
Well, it varies. It varies. So sometimes I have a good sense of where I'm going, what I want to do, and the challenge is to how to realize it, how to achieve it. But the other thing I always keep in mind is my dear colleague Reg Gibbons, who was an amazing poet and fiction writer. You know, Reg said that all writing is exploratory, and you know, even when you think you know what you're going to do, you may end up in a different place, which is the beautiful thing about creative practice, right? It's in the doing of it that some of those realizations occur.
Jon, can you talk a little bit about your writing process in general? Do you try to write every day? Do you come to the computer or whatever you're writing on with an idea, or do you sit down and just sort of wait and see what happens? What does that sort of day to day look like?
So for a long time, I was serving as the chair of a department, and that took up a lot of mental space. Even if I were to sit down every day, I wouldn't have been able to write that much. But I would say that, you know, I do try to write frequently, and sometimes I'll write things down in pen. I'll take notes. Sometimes I, you know, go straight to the computer, and it varies. But often is I'll just take notes, you know, and write a little bit whenever I can. So usually several times a week. Sometimes, you know, now that the summer's here, I've gone back to several projects and I'm able to kind of look at them every day. With the hope that there's, you know, I mean, life doesn't interrupt as it does sometimes.
Right. Jon, you write poetry, you write fiction, you write pieces for art exhibits. Does your process change depending on what you're writing? Is it different when you wrote a piece from Counternarratives versus when you're writing poetry for punks?
So I always say that, you know, when I was much younger, you know, everything kind of first came to me as a poem. Like I would always imagine, I mean, it was clearly a story, but I was like, okay, how can I, you know, write this as a poem? Or I can write this poem, right? And then I think I reached a period where I was like, no, this is clearly a story. You're trying, there's a narrative here that's not, you know, that's different from how we understand narrative in poetry. And sometimes with poetry, I mean, I can write, you know, I've written poems where I've just been at a sitting, you know, people like great poets like Frank O'Hara, you know, he used to right during his lunch hour. And there was a period when I was, again, much younger and I had a job, and I would actually, during my lunch in the city, I would go and write poems, sometimes in Washington Square Park or find a cafe. Most of them are pretty bad, but anyway, there was that process of, just learning to be able to write whenever like in the interstices of my life of work and everything else. But then I also, when I was at the Cave Canem workshops, they had this amazing kind of principle in which every day you write a poem, right? You wake up and you write a poem. You're in a workshop or you're in the evening, you write a poem. And so everyone's writing poetry like every day. And, you realize at the end of a week, you might have one good poem, you might have a few squibs, but that practice, that daily practice is really helpful to get your mind working, right? So I feel like with poetry, I often will have like a project I'm working on or a particular aim I'm going in, but then I also try to be open to whatever language, feeling, what's happening in the world that might occasion a poem, and and sort of follow that trail. And whereas with fiction, I feel like it definitely needs more time, and I have to be more intentional. So, but I also leave myself open to whatever may come.
Jon, there's a question that we ask every single author who comes on the show, which is if you could invite somebody onto our show to have us ask them about their creative process, who would be the person that you'd be most interested in hearing from?
Oh my God, there's so many people. It can only be one person. Really? Well, I mentioned her in and we were talking about, Counternarratives. And Tisa Bryant has this beautiful book, the book Residual, and I highly recommend it. It's just stunning. I mean, she's doing so many things. So it's about her mother, it's about history, it's about, I mean, it's just, there's just so many things there. So I would love to hear her talk about this on your show. Right? And especially about the process of writing it.
Jon, should we do some rapid fire to close things up?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, Jon, if you don't mind, we have 9 or 10 questions, and you don't have to give us long, detailed answers, just sort of the first thing that comes to mind. All right. What's one aspect of writing you think you're particularly good at?
Characterization.
How about one aspect of writing you think you're bad at?
Dialogue.
What's harder to write, the first line or the last line?
For me, it's always the first line. Endings come to me before the beginnings, right?
I'm going to go off the rapid fire format here for a sec, but do you tinker with first lines a lot, or do you know when you've got a good one?
Well, I tinker with them a lot. I think
Get them perfect.
Yes.
Yeah.
What's the first thing you edit out of a draft?
Extraneous dialogue.
What's a word you always misspell that autocorrect saves you?
Oh my God. Well, you mean when I'm writing or just in general?
Yeah. Well,
either one. Could be in general too.
Okay, in general, because my fingers are so big. I always hit R instead of E, so it's always THR. So if you go to my Instagram page, you'll see the. So I'm trying to correct that, but yeah, it drives me crazy.
It's always the words you least expect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. The easiest word in one of the easiest words in the language. Yeah.
Yeah. Did Counternarratives go through any alternative titles before you landed on it, or was that always going to be the title of the collection from the get-go?
That was actually always going to be the title. And I thought, let me just say this quickly. I thought that I had come up with that title relatively late in the not late in the process, but when I'd written those 4 or 5 stories. But actually, I found a old notebook, and so right when I was in graduate school, I actually had written that down. I was the idea of the counter narrative. I'd actually written that down. So the seed was there early on. Yeah. And I was glad my publisher thought it, I think we did have a little discussion.
Yeah.
They're wonderful, new directions.
Mm-hmm.
But we had discussions was this too academic? Because that's always a fear. It's like you don't want to scare readers away. But
right.
Yeah.
But they gave it a great cover design that
I
feels
love
very
this,
non-academic. So
this cover.
Yeah. Do you write in Microsoft Word, Google Docs, longhand with pen and paper? What's the typical format?
Microsoft Word or in a notebook.
Yep. When you're writing, do you have music, TV, podcasts on in the background? Do you write with complete silence?
I usually write with complete silence, but I always have books around me. I'm surrounded by books, so I can always open a book. If I reach an impasse, I will open a book and just read. So I feel like you can always learn from another writer.
You've got to be the fourth or fifth author we've had on who has basically said some version of that. If you're stuck, open up any book and there will be answers in there for you. Final question. What's your go-to procrastination method?
Probably I will get up and walk around. I find walking, it gets my brain going, unlike anything else. And snacking is not preferred, but it happens quite often. Yeah. Yeah.
One of those sounds like procrastination. The other one sounds like it's more of a productivity method.
Right, right. But what I like, if I really can't. So again, if I pick up a book and it's just kind of like that's not working, then I will actually like walk around just to get the blood flowing. But yeah, as I said, I have to get up from the desk and go grab a snack. But that's procrastination.
Yeah.
The blood goes to the stomach, not the brain, so it's not a particular help. But hey, it works.
Perfect. All right, Jon, that's all the questions I think we have. Cory, do you have anything else?
No, this has been a lot of fun to chat with you, Jon, and learn a little bit more about your process.
Thank you so much. You guys are wonderful. I'm glad I was able to actually do this today and be in conversation with you both.
Us
Definitely.
too. It was great to talk to you. Really fascinating process and an incredible work.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.